Every day as a small business owner feels like solving a puzzle. One moment you're cruising along, and the next, there's a shipping snag that has you scrambling. But here's a surprise you will like. With Progressive, small business owners save 13% on their commercial auto insurance when they pay in full. So go ahead, surprise yourself. Get a quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Discounts not available in all states or situations.
Victims anticipate the credibility discount. They anticipate that when they come forward, they are very likely to be disbelieved, to be blamed, to be disregarded. And the effects of that, I've heard over and over again, and there's good research to support this. The effects of being dismissed when you come forward can be as bad as or worse than the abuse itself.
That was Deborah Turkheimer on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey, listeners, just a super quick reminder that you can listen to the podcast ad-free by supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Or you can support the podcast with a one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you to everyone who's already supporting us. Be sure to stay tuned to the end of the episode for our co-host discussion of today's interview.
Hey, everybody, it's Jill here, and I'm so excited to introduce you to today's guest, Deborah Turkheimer. Deborah is a professor at Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law. She earned her undergraduate degree from Harvard College and her law degree from Yale Law School. Turkheimer served for 5 years as an assistant district attorney in the New York County District Attorney's Office, where she specialized in domestic violence and child abuse prosecution. She teaches and writes in the areas of criminal law, evidence, and feminist legal theory. She is also the author of Credible: Why We Doubt Accusers and Protect Abusers, which she is here to talk about with us today. So, Deborah, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I think you might be the first attorney that we've talked to on the podcast. And I always say, as a psychologist, I've always been fascinated by the law. And if I had known that forensic psychology was a thing back when I started my journey, that is the route that I would have taken. So I'm very excited to have you here. We have this intersection of law and psychology that we can talk about today.
As an undergraduate, that's what I gravitated to, and I was a psychology major. So a lot of overlapping interests, and my work draws on psychology quite a bit. I think it's hugely important to understanding how the law is formed, and then, of course, the impact that the law has on people's lives.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think, and a lot of what we'll talk about today, I mean, that subtitle says it perfectly in your book, Why We Doubt Accusers and Protect Abusers. And reading through the book, I mean, everything, it's all psychology, really. So let's talk about that. You talk about a credibility complex. Can you define what that is?
Yes. The credibility complex is a cluster of forces that shape how we judge credibility. We might think that we're making these individualized assessments, but it turns out they're patterned, and these patterns come up over and over again. And that's because we are impacted by law and we're impacted by culture. Those are the major forces that shape how we think about who to believe and who to trust and who to blame.
Right. And so then you go on to talk about the credibility discount and credibility inflation.
So when we judge credibility, we tend to do it in these patterned ways. And one pattern that comes up over and over again is that when accusers come forward with an allegation of abuse, their credibility is discounted. So I call this the credibility discount. It tracks lines of power in our society. And so when someone lacks power, social power, when someone perhaps is more vulnerable, and I should say often this happens to women, they receive the credibility discount. On the flip side is credibility inflation. And that's when someone's credibility gets a boost that's not warranted. So the credibility discount is unwarranted skepticism. The credibility boost is an unwarranted lift in how we perceive someone's credibility, especially if they're powerful, especially if they're high status, especially if they occupy these positions of real privilege. And I'm going to say mostly powerful men get the highest credibility boosts or credibility inflation.
Right. So there's that gender difference. And then I imagine there's also probably a difference based on race. I mean, do you think that these differences kind of exist across marginalized groups?
Yeah. So I think the more marginalized the person coming forward, the steeper the credibility discount as a rule. And then again, on the flip side of it, sort of the more someone has social power, the more their credibility will get boosted. And these are general rules. Of course, there are always exceptions to them. But when I look across the law and I look across culture, I see this happening over and over again, enough that I wanted to give these dynamics names.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about rape myths. I think it's really interesting that these myths tend to continue, even though we keep hearing statistics that, so for example, we all know that statistically you're less likely to be raped by a stranger in a dark alley in a bad neighborhood at night with a weapon, right? And more likely to be assaulted by someone you know at a party in your dorm room. Do you have any sense of why these myths continue to be perpetrated?
Well, I don't want to veer too far into your territory, but I do think that coming to terms with how common abuse is and the kind of abuse that's perpetrated by the people we know and trust, that is hugely destabilizing. And so it's hard to really believe it. It's hard to sort of take it on board in a meaningful way. And it's easier to put some distance between ourselves and the kind of rape that happens most often.
Yeah. And it reminds me, I was thinking of this when I was reading, and then you ended up talking about it, is the just world theory. So this idea that we think good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And so when a quote unquote good person is sexually assaulted, that is, like you're saying, it's so destabilizing. And gosh, if that could happen to you, then it could happen to me. And that feels very scary. And that's where victim blaming comes in. Oh, it's because you were drunk. Oh, it's because you wore that outfit. Oh, it's because you were walking alone at night. And so if I can explain it away as something you did wrong, then I maintain my own illusion of safety.
Absolutely. And just world theory also allows us to maintain an illusion of control. Because if these kinds of things only happen to people who make bad decisions, then as long as I make good decisions, I will be safe. And I think that that's a big part of it too. We sort of hold on to this notion that if we just do the right things, then we're not going to be victimized.
Right. Yeah. What about the perfect victim myth? What is that and where does that come from?
It comes from these rape myths. The idea that mythical rape is by a stranger in an alley with a weapon. The perfect victim is someone who responds to that. She fights back. She doesn't maintain contact with her abuser afterwards. She has, the ability to recall exactly what happened. She certainly had no contact with the perpetrator ahead of time, so she didn't do anything to quote unquote bring it upon herself. And so we can sort of derive the perfect victim from the stranger rape mythology that we've been talking about. And the danger and the problem of the perfect victim is that when someone comes forward who didn't behave the way the perfect victim is supposed to behave, she's less credible. if she behaved in a certain way beforehand, maybe dressed a certain way, maybe she was drinking beforehand, maybe she was on a date, right, with the person who raped her. Or maybe during, she didn't fight back hard enough. She didn't scream hard enough. Maybe afterwards, she didn't report right away. And maybe due to the effects of trauma, she's not able to sort of give a perfectly linear narrative. All of those things are going to count against her when she comes forward. So the farther the accuser departs from the perfect victim archetype, the more likely it is that she's going to get a really steep credibility discount.
And this is what we see play out in the courtroom, right? I mean, this is what like defense attorneys really capitalize on when they're trying to get a perpetrator off, if they're even brought to trial.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, most of these cases never, ever reach a courtroom or a trial. There's a huge problem of underreporting for reasons we can talk about. Even when an allegation is reported to the police, it's often the investigation goes nowhere and the case never makes it to a prosecutor. And then prosecutors dismiss cases as well. And so we're talking about a fraction of cases that get to trial. And when they do, the perfect victim is deployed in ways that really hurt real victims on the witness stand. The cross-examination can be brutal.
Why is it that victims fail to come forward?
There are so many reasons, but one that I think is often overlooked is that victims anticipate the credibility discount. They anticipate that when they come forward, they are very likely to be disbelieved, to be blamed, to be disregarded. And the effects of that, I've heard over and over again, and there's good research to support this. The effects of being dismissed when you come forward can be as bad as or worse than the abuse itself. And I think that's something that, people maybe who haven't experienced it don't know and might be surprised by. It's, this notion that the aftermath of abuse can be every bit as traumatizing as abuse.
Yeah, you talk about a documentary called The Second Assault.
Yeah, it's a phenomenon called the second assault. And it has a lot to do with what psychologist Jennifer Freyd has called betrayal trauma. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that when we're hurt by one person, that's a terrible thing. But when the people who we trust, our community, our institution turns against us, that can be wounding in a very different way, deeply, deeply wounding, because it may suggest that we're not worthy, that we're not valued by the people that we're supposed to be valued by.
Yeah, it's horrible. I mean, I've only talked about this a little bit on the podcast, but my daughter was assaulted in the bathroom of her school shortly after she turned 7.
Oh, sorry.
It was horrible, but I will say, I think both for her and for me, the aftermath was more traumatic than what actually happened. Her principal actually said, well, she wasn't supposed to be in that bathroom. Mm-hmm. And I said, you understand that that's the little kid version of she shouldn't have been wearing a short skirt? And he was so, at least my interpretation was that all the principal cared about was his reputation. And he just wanted to sweep everything under the rug. And I will never forget, I filed a Title IX complaint. I went to the school. I went to the police. I did everything I could think to do. Nothing went anywhere. And my daughter even said, I get choked up remembering this. It was a long time ago, but she said to me, you did nothing. Because the consequences were such that nothing good came out of it. So it appeared that not only did the powers that be do nothing, but her mom, like the one person that's supposed to be there to be able to fix this, her perception was that I did nothing because she was only 7. And, she had never gotten in trouble before. And all of a sudden after this happened, she was constantly getting in trouble. And I just thought, already at 7 years old, she is learning that boys can do whatever they want to girls. And if girls come forward, they will either not be believed, or if they're believed, no one will care. And then when they struggle because they're traumatized, they're the ones who get in trouble, not the perpetrators who did the bad thing in the first place. And I will say the other thing that was horrible is when the principal reached out to these 2 boys' parents, their response was, not my child. right? So you know that the police said this is definitely not the first time this has happened because they were so brazen. The police said they've done this before. And you can just see the path that these boys are likely on, given the lack of consequences from the school, from their parents, from everything.
There's so much wrapped up in that story. It really captures so many of these dynamics that, as you say, start really, really early on. And it's about the sense that the collective really sort of comes together to protect the abuser rather than think about ways that we can end abuse by imposing, and this is a big part of it, by imposing consequences, meaningful accountability. Unless and until we do that, this is going to continue.
Right. Well, you even talk about in the book how disbelief of accusers is even built into the penal codes. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful to break credibility down into three parts. So we often focus on the question of what happened. And that's a really important part of credibility. Who do we believe? Who do we trust? But there's also the question of who's to blame, because so often we shift blame. Even when we know what happened, we put the blame on the victim rather than on the abuser. And then the third part is about care. Do we care? Does it rise to the level of concern for us? Because so often people know that it happened, and yet still they're not moved to act because it's not important enough. And so each one of those components of credibility are hugely important. And in the law, there's credibility discounting built in on all sides of it. So there are special rules that bake in disbelief of victims. There are special rules that shift blame, particularly when it comes to intoxication. Rules that allow, for instance, jurors to hear about how someone was dressed, whether someone was drinking, those kinds of victim blaming behaviors. And then on the how important is it, or is it bad enough for someone to care, there are all sorts of rules that really set a very, very high bar for what counts as actionable sexual harassment or sexual assault. And if it falls below that bar, it doesn't matter. It doesn't count. And so along each one of these dimensions, I think the law is a form of credibility discounting. And it's a way that we can shine a mirror on our own cultural blind spots and biases to look at how the law is doing this too.
Right. Like I found it interesting. You talk about how, so if the victim has been drinking alcohol, that is used against them to discount their credibility. But if a perpetrator is drinking alcohol, it's used to excuse their behavior.
That's right. I mean, there's, I think, an obligation that's placed on women and girls particularly to keep assault at bay, to sort of prevent this from happening by sort of doing whatever they can to stop it. And it used to be that there was this physical resistance requirement that was a formal requirement in law, where if someone didn't fight back hard enough, there was no legal case. Now we don't have that formal rule, but in these other ways that we're talking about, we still require victims to do enough to keep themselves safe. And if they don't do it, then they're to blame.
Yeah, the other thing that I think falls in this area is how often we hear the phrase, he said, she said. But you never hear that if my house is robbed and I call the police. They're not like, well, that's a he said, she said. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like when I think of any other crime, you never hear those terms unless it's about sexual assault.
And that's absolutely right. And I think that what you're getting at, and what I write about a lot in the book, is that the she said part of that is a way of dismissing the importance of a victim's account of what happened, right? It's a way of saying, let's just put that aside because we can't believe it. And what I want to suggest is that our starting point is disbelief very often. And that's a problem, right? I don't think that we automatically believe everyone who comes forward. I certainly don't believe that an allegation alone is proof beyond a reasonable doubt in every criminal case. But I do think that the starting point needs to be a fair one. And all too often, it is not.
Well, it almost sets up a reality that, like, unless we're all wearing body cams every minute of every day, it's like you have no shot, because what else is there? I mean, there's the report. Then, of course, there's a rape kit if you get the rape kit. But we all know about this ridiculous backlog of evidence. And I actually interviewed Michelle Bowdler, who wrote a book called, do you know this? Do you know Michelle? She wrote a book called Is Rape a Crime? And she tells a story of being brutally gang raped. And the police literally put the evidence in a drawer, like never even investigated the crime.
Yeah.
And anytime she would call and follow up, they would basically yell at her and say, I told you I would call you if I had anything new. They didn't have anything new because they literally did nothing to investigate. And that wasn't a date rape. I mean, that was 2 serial predators that had been breaking into homes and raping women for years.
It's terrible. I mean, these shelved rape kits are tangible proof that police investigations are often short-circuited. They end before they get off the ground because the police decide that the person is not credible or that it doesn't matter. And then the other thing we know is that even with DNA evidence, these cases often hinge on a question of consent. And so credibility is always going to be essential. And to your point about needing a video camera, even in cases where there is videotaped evidence, you'll often see many of these same defenses, these sort of tired defenses come up. Well, maybe she was consenting to that, even though she looks lifeless, even though she looks passive. And as a practical matter, what we need is many, many victims before we're moved to action as a collective. And I think this notion that there's credibility in mass, there's credibility in numbers in the Me Too era is something we've got to reckon with, because it shouldn't be the case that you've got to have dozens of victims, 10 victims, even 3 victims, right? For us to care, to be moved, to believe. It should be enough that one credible victim moves us to action.
Yes. And I mean, and statistically, we know, let's see. So I think it's 1 in 3 girls will be sexually abused by the time she's 18, 1 in 6 boys, though most people think that's an underestimate. And then after 18, it's something like 1/4 to 1/3 of women will be sexually assaulted or raped. So like, we know these numbers are astronomical, and yet we're constantly questioning. There is a belief that false reporting happens all the time, when I think it's under 1% or 1 to 2%, something like that. And you even talked in the book about there were surveys of law enforcement officers, and they believe that there is a high incidence of false reporting. I mean, so like, what do we even do with that? Like, meanwhile, we have people that are like freaking out that their kids are going to get kidnapped when the likelihood of that is so incredibly low. But when it comes to sexual assault, sexual abuse, everyone, it's like they just want to put their head in the sand because it seems too scary to address how prevalent it really is.
Yeah, I mean, our sense of the statistics, I think, are wildly skewed, wildly off. And in the course of researching my book, I would often ask, friends and even colleagues what they thought the percentage of false rape allegations is. And it was always way too high. I mean, sometimes orders of magnitude. And I think part of that is that we have in the popular imagination these caricatures of women who come forward and lie about rape. Maybe it's the woman scorned. Maybe it's the woman who's out for revenge, or it's the political pawn and she's being used in some political game, or she's the gold digger and she's out for money. I mean, I can tick through the list and I write about each one of these because I think that sort of pulling back the curtain and making these characters visible maybe goes some way toward helping people to identify when they themselves are having that reaction, where they're defaulting to this notion that, oh, this is a type of person and I'm going to put the accuser in this box and decide she's lying just because, these tropes have been around for a really long time.
Right. Or the other one that just came to mind is thinking about I just flashed back to the Brock Turner case with the don't let 30 seconds ruin a promising young man's life. But there is really never any acknowledgement of how much that 30 seconds is going to ruin the victim's life for a hell of a lot longer than 30 seconds.
Yeah. I mean, just as, we, tend to care less than we should about victims, we often have an inflated sense of what the consequences will be, or I should say how the consequences will affect the future of a man with promise, right? So there's this real care gap that we see between how we relate to victims of abuse and then how we relate to those who perpetrate it.
Hey listeners, I have a brand new office in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I made myself a pretty valuable addition because I brought my AquaTrue countertop water purifier to share with my suite mates. So no more contaminated tap water or microplastics from bottled water for a whole bunch of New Hampshire mental health providers. Now they too get to join 98% of customers who say their drinking water is cleaner, safer, and healthier. Really, it's no wonder AquaTrue has been featured in Business Insider, Popular Science, and Good Housekeeping. Head to aquatrue.com now and get 20% off your purifier using promo code POTC. AquaTrue even comes with a 30-day best tasting water guarantee or your money back. Take the guesswork out of pure, great tasting water with this exclusive podcast-only offer now at aquatrue.com. That's AQUATRU.com using promo code POTC. And remember, when you support our sponsors, you're supporting the podcast.
Hey therapists, this is for you. I want you to know about Simple Practice, an all-in-one EHR that is HIPAA compliant, high-trust certified, and built specifically for therapists. I've been in private practice for about 7 years, and I've used Simple Practice since I first started. Simple Practice helps me streamline everything. I just send each new client a link, and they log on to my portal to access my consent form, billing, invoices, and set up appointment reminders. I even use Simple Practice as my HIPAA-compliant telehealth video platform. It frees up admin time so I can focus on the important stuff, seeing my clients. And I'm not the only POTC co-host who uses it. Emily does too, and Jill uses it to manage her group practice. If you're just starting out or growing your practice, there's also a credentialing service that takes the headache out of insurance enrollment, which will save you a lot of time and effort. Simple Practice is trusted by over 250,000 health and wellness professionals, and you can feel that in how thoughtfully it's built for our work. If you're ready to simplify the business side of your practice, now is the perfect time to try Simple Practice. Start with a 7-day free trial and then get 50% off your first 3 months. Just go to simplepractice.com to claim the offer. Again, that's simplepractice.com.
You talk a lot about the idea of a monster abuser. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the monster abuser is in many ways kind of the corollary to the perfect victim. And what I mean by that is they both sort of grow out of this notion of what stranger rape looks like. So the monster abuser is someone who's deviant. He's someone who would sexually assault a stranger in an alley with a weapon. And the fact is most abusers don't do it that way, and they don't look deviant and they don't look exceptional. They look like our coworker. They look like our neighbor. They look like our friend. And what the monster abuser does is he makes it more difficult to think that someone who doesn't look like that archetype, that scary predator, actually could do these things. It makes it easier for us to disbelieve when someone comes forward against a man who we might like, right? We might see behaving really well in other contexts. And I think this is just another mechanism for discounting the credibility of victims and putting distance between these allegations and real life.
Right. I'm thinking of the cases where I think like with Clarence Thomas, for example, there were multiple women who had worked with him prior to Anita Hill, writing letters and coming forward and saying how wonderful he is and how he never did anything to me. But, an abuser isn't going to abuse every single human who comes across their path.
That's right.
Right. And so I don't think false equivalence is exactly the right term, but it's faulty reasoning, and yet people fall for it.
They do. And there's also, as you know, this halo effect where if someone has some good traits, then we decide that he's, perfect in every regard. And of course, that's not how life works. Life is messy. Life is complicated, as are people. And so I think until we can dispel this notion that abusers are monsters and monstrous and abuse everyone in their path, we're going to have a really hard time judging credibility fairly.
Yeah, absolutely. What is your sense of why the law allows accusers' pasts? You had brought this up earlier. It allows accusers' pasts to be dissected, but often the abuser's past is shielded from discovery. Like if they have a history of this type of behavior, that is often kept out of the courtroom. And yet a woman is asked how many sexual partners she's had and, all of these other things. It just seems like such an imbalance in terms of what is and isn't allowed. And like, how does that happen in our justice system? Doesn't seem very just.
Yeah. I mean, especially in criminal court, there's sort of a axiomatic principle that says when someone is charged with a crime, he gets to be tried only with evidence of that crime, and he comes with a clean slate. And, there are some good reasons for that, but as you say, the imbalance is really problematic, right? And so the asymmetry when someone then comes to court accusing a person of sexual abuse of some sort, and the cross-examination, and in many cases, the sort of pretrial discovery is so invasive, and it opens, it opens the door to just about everything that has been traumatic in this person's life. And that is another deterrent to coming forward. I mean, we have talked about underreporting. It's a process that can be excruciating, and it takes a lot of fortitude to decide, nevertheless, to move forward with an allegation.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned Jennifer Freyd earlier, and that makes me think of the DARVO acronym that she developed, the Deny, Accuse, Reverse, Victim, and Offender. And that seems to be the defense attorney's playbook. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And I want to be clear that defense attorneys have a duty to zealously represent their clients within ethical bounds. What is interesting to me and of concern, they're doing it because it works, or they're doing it because it has the potential to work. So once the trier of fact or the jury in this, these cases, once those juries decide that this type of attack is not going to work, once that happens, the attacks, will stop. There'll be a different way to represent a client, but it's because they've had such traction over the years. These playbooks have worked. That's why we continue to see them.
Yeah. Do you think that things are changing? I mean, are prosecutors bringing people onto the stand like Jennifer Freyd to talk about DARVO, to talk about fawning, the psychology behind trauma and why women don't always fight back, or why women stay in contact with their abusers after the fact? There is so much psychology behind the impacts of trauma that I feel like have often been left out of a courtroom, that if they were in the courtroom would have the ability to turn some of this around.
I love that question. And in part because I am so encouraged by this development of bringing experts into court to talk about what you're describing, that I wrote a paper on kind of the promise of expert testimony in these cases, and moving beyond, what's called rape trauma syndrome, which is just a really pathologizing way of talking about a lot of this, and just using the expertise of people who understand the dynamics of sexual abuse, helping to educate the jury, and in high-profile cases beyond, right? When these high-profile cases reach the media, then we all get educated. And so I do feel encouraged that this is happening more, and prosecutors are harnessing this expertise.
Yeah, I read E. Jean Carroll's memoir, and I think that's a really good example of that. So on the plaintiff's side, the psychologist that they hired to evaluate, to do a full assessment of E. Jean was so thorough and such an incredibly brilliant trauma expert that, I think that was 90% of how that case was won. And on the defendant's case, that was not the case with the role of the psychologist that was there. And it really seemed like it made a really big difference in the outcome of that trial.
Yeah, I mean, trauma is a perfect example. Many lay people don't understand the effects of trauma over time. And so it's really helpful and maybe even essential in some cases to bring in that kind of expert testimony.
Yeah.
Ever notice how life's best stories don't happen in your living room? They happen on the open road, out on the water, or parked under the stars. At Progressive, they get that you want to focus on the experience, not worry about the what-ifs. That's why they offer quality insurance designed for your ride, whether that's a boat, RV, or motorcycle. Adventure with confidence. Visit Progressive.com and see how easy it is to protect your favorite way to get away. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in D.C. Prices vary based on how you buy.
In your book, you talk a little bit about the role of attractiveness when it comes to this, the credibility and the monster abuser. And I had the thought that it's a little bit like Goldilocks, like the porridge is either too hot or too cold. Can you talk a little bit about the role of attractiveness?
Yeah, it's very much like a Goldilocks problem because, and this is based on some case law, but even more my conversations with plaintiffs' attorneys who've handled all sorts of cases, but particularly workplace sexual harassment. And the problem is if you have a client who's not seen as attractive enough, it's to some people implausible that this person would be the victim of sexual advances, right? If she's not attractive enough. Completely misunderstanding what, sexual harassment, how much of it is about power, completely misunderstanding that, looking at this person and saying, I can't imagine that anyone would want to make sexual advances to her because she's not attractive. On the other end of the spectrum is the plaintiff who is seen as too attractive. She's so attractive. She's sort of irresistible. Anyone would be attracted to her. And, sort of doubting that these advances were unwelcome, which is part of the law of sexual harassment. And so I'm told that from an attractiveness perspective, being somewhere right in the middle where you're not too attractive, but you're attractive enough to really hit that sweet spot of credibility is what these attorneys are seeing.
Does the attractiveness of the perpetrator matter? Because I could see an argument that why would he have to harass or assault anyone? Look how handsome he is. He could get any woman that he wanted. He wouldn't do that. Do they use that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's definitely something that I've heard, bandied about in the popular discourse, right? Kind of going along with these men who aren't monster abusers because they're handsome. And so they wouldn't need to resort to whatever they're accused of doing in order to sort of date or find women.
Yeah. I interviewed a woman named Chantel Conto. So she's amazing. She's only, I think, 27, and she already got consent education mandated into the entire Australian school curriculum.
Fabulous.
Isn't that amazing? And so she wrote a book called Consent Laid Bare, and she parses out different types of rapists. There were 4 different kinds. And, the first 3 are kind of like the violent monster abuser that you think of, and the percentage of those are very small. And then the last category, which is most, she calls the entitled opportunist rapist. And she said, and it's these people that are, good athletes and powerful and handsome and whatever, but that it's essentially where this comes from is a high sense of entitlement and a low sense of empathy. And then I thought, gosh, this actually relates beyond just sexual assault. I mean, this is trolls. This is any other kind of interpersonal violence or crime. You can really kind of see that combination playing out in a number of, problematic scenarios, basically.
Yeah, which makes it sort of even more perverse when you look at this credibility boost that men in power tend to get. Because I'm going to go out on a limb and say that, these positions of power will tend to correlate with a sense of entitlement, right? So it really doesn't make a lot of sense how we tend to reason about these allegations. But, these are biases and misconceptions. And my sense is that many people want to do right when they judge these accusations, and they want to do better. And so the hope is that by the process of education and by informing people and having people take a good hard look in the mirror, that we can do better.
Yeah. Do you know if that's happening with law enforcement? I mean, are they getting education about false reporting, about, the perfect victim and the myths and the monster abusers and that kind of thing? Does it seem like there's any kind of tide change there?
Yeah, I mean, I can say that there are law enforcement trainings and there's some, work being done in prosecutors' offices as well, and some really good protocols that are out there for departments that want to do training. So particularly around trauma, I think that there has been progress around trauma-informed interviewing and trauma-informed investigation. And so, we've by no means solved for this problem, but I think that we're starting to make some progress.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it feels like such an uphill battle because at the end of the day, we're still living in a massively patriarchal culture and misogyny is alive and well. And so, there can be all the trainings in the world, but if you're trying to deliver them to an audience that isn't open to receiving that information. And certainly I'm not generalizing all of law enforcement or anything like that, but we still have this kind of, I think, uphill battle with the level of sexism that seems to be getting worse over the last several years, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been some discouraging developments in the last few years, as you're suggesting. And in the end, I think this culture of impunity really needs to be upended before we're going to have this dramatic change that we're seeking, right? So the trainings aren't going to do it. It's about what happens in the end. Are we willing to impose accountability? Are we willing to hold people to account for their actions? Are we willing to step in? Are we willing to do our part as the people who are watching, the bystanders?
Yeah. Do you think shows like Law and Order SVU help or hurt?
I can tell you that my students seem to love it. Many of them, I think, come to law school in part because of what they've seen.
Olivia Benson.
Yeah. It's probably a little bit of both, right? Because, I think to the extent these shows can really humanize and shine a light on sort of what it is to be involved in these processes as a victim of crime, and these crimes especially. When they set our expectations around what the process looks like and should look like, I guess that's where maybe there's a little bit of a problem.
Yeah, it's not altogether realistic, especially, the whole thing being solved in an hour. But I do think, they make it a point to always believe victims initially when they're coming forward. I mean, that is at least a message out there. And I think they've layered in some interesting trauma narratives too that have been cool. And I think Mariska Hargitay is heavily involved in not charities, but programs and things for sexual assault survivors. And
I think that's right. I think she's become a real advocate.
Yeah.
She's and this has become a cause that's important to her.
Yeah. Yeah. What about you? So given that this is an area that seems to be, frustrating to say the least, what drew you to want to practice in this domain?
Well, I, was, as you say, practicing in the area for several years in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And I really, truly loved working with the victims, the survivors who were so resilient and managed to find a way forward toward healing, toward justice. And I think that inspiration is part of what continues to motivate the work that I do now as an academic in my teaching and my writing. Those stories, those relationships are with me still.
That's cool. Anything that I didn't ask you about that you think would be helpful, interesting, et cetera, for our listeners to know?
Yeah. The book focuses a lot on law enforcement officers and prosecutors and juries and our formal systems of accountability, Title IX in schools, Title VII in workplaces. But the first report is often made to a loved one. And it's to a family member, it's to a friend, it's to a roommate. And I think that if we, as those people operating in those informal capacities, can do better to validate, to empower, I think that will really make a difference too. That can not only help a person in the moment to begin healing, but it can also dictate the course. It can also mean the difference between deciding to report to campus disciplinary authorities, to the police, or not. And so I think that this is a message that I try to deliver to everyone, because all of us at some point are going to be in a position, I think, to make a difference in someone's life if we're trusted with that kind of accusation.
Yeah. And so are there any do's and don'ts other than if someone tells you the initial response should be, I believe you, but is there anything else that you would say to yes, you should do and or say this, and no, you should not do and or say this?
I mean, that yes, I believe you is hugely important in that moment for the person to understand that they've confided in a person who does believe. That's the most important thing. And then I my view is, what can I do to help you in this moment?
Yeah.
And that the answer is going to be different for different people, and it's going to change in all likelihood over time. But the survivors I've spoken to have said that their person or their people who were with them from the start, who were able to sort of stay with them throughout, made all the difference in the world.
Are there circumstances where you ever discourage survivors from coming forward, not necessarily coming forward to loved ones, but coming forward to law enforcement or to the powers that be at a university or something like that?
What I would say is I don't encourage or discourage, because it is such a personal decision and it will have benefits and drawbacks, whatever course someone chooses. So I would like for the systems in place to handle accusations of abuse to be more just, to be more fair. I will continue to do whatever I can in my capacity as a writer, as a speaker, as a teacher, to help improve those systems. But in the end, people have very good reasons for choosing not to come forward. And I would never presume to know what's best for someone.
Yeah, that makes sense. I will say it's a small N, but of the people that I have interviewed who have chosen to speak up and speak out about these things, so far, I have not had one person say they regret it. And every one of them suffered some pretty significant costs to doing so. And they're happy that they did it. And they felt like coming forward, even if it didn't go in an ideal way, or even if they didn't get the outcome that they were hoping for, it did help them with their healing and their growth to be open, to speak up, because I think otherwise when you hold this as like a dirty little secret, it just festers inside when like you didn't do anything wrong. This is not your shame to carry.
Yeah.
This is their shame to carry. So I think, what comes to mind for me sometimes is like, if we can hold those outcomes lightly, we can only control the steps we take, right? The actions, and the outcomes we don't get to control. But even if you don't get the outcome you're looking for, sometimes, just having a voice can be pretty healing and powerful in its own right.
Yeah, that seems very wise to me. I think I'm going to have to quote you next time I'm
Please do.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, if people want to learn more about you, find your book, all the things, where can they go?
So DeborahTurkheimer.com is where I have information about the book. And some resources. I have a resource page as well. So hopefully that can help for folks who are looking for that. It's www.DeborahTurkheimer, all one word. And I think that there's some information about me and what I do there as well.
Excellent. And we will put that in the show notes so everyone knows how to spell your whole name.
Perfect.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much for doing this. This was such a great conversation. I really appreciate it and loved chatting with you.
Oh, I enjoyed it so much. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to my interview with Deborah. I am here with Emily for the co-host post. Emily, what are your thoughts?
Hi, Jill. I am so happy to do this with you because I know how personal this whole topic is for you and how much it drives even your new work that I think the listeners would want to hear more about. So you kind of touched on some of this during the interview, but I think it would be really helpful for people to hear a little bit about your recent new project.
Oh, okay. Well, listeners, you'll be hearing a lot more about it because I think we're going to do like a full episode about this sometime in the fall. But, essentially, I have a brother who was incarcerated, and it has been very traumatic for my family. And I am of the mind that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And that when we are quiet about painful, hard stories where we take them on like they're our own shame, the only person that benefits is the perpetrator. And I feel very strongly that we need to be talking about these things. My family disagrees. And so that experience has really led me to kind of a calling to try to inspire people to speak up more. And the way this relates to Deborah and her book, it's all about doubting accusers and protecting abusers. And like, this has really become my mission. Like, I really want to find a way to help stop that, And so I can't remember if I've mentioned this here before, but I was interviewed on the Betrayal Weekly podcast, which is a big, like, top 10 Apple true crime podcast. So if you look up Betrayal Weekly and just look for Jill back in September, that is the story of my family, my brother.
We can put it in the show notes, right?
Oh, yeah, we can absolutely link to it in the show notes. Yeah.
I will just say it was a very moving episode. So I
they did an amazing job. It's one of my favorite podcasts. And the interview was, God, at least 3 hours. And they distilled it into like a 35-minute story. And they did a tremendous, tremendous job. And so that has really inspired me to keep this work going. So I've developed my own new podcast that's called We the Sunlight, because of course the idea is sunlight is the best disinfectant and we shouldn't have to shine it alone. And I interview truth tellers. So for example, I interviewed Harvey Weinstein's massage therapist. I interviewed a survivor of the Pulse nightclub shooting. I interviewed a victim of a romance scam. I just got a yes from a Facebook whistleblower. And so it's not out there yet. I'm going to complete a full season, and I'm hoping to publish it in September. So keep your ears peeled, your eyes peeled, and I'll of course announce it as we get closer. But the episodes are basically people telling their story, what factors they considered when they thought about whether to speak up, whether to be the accuser, knowing that accusers are often not believed and that abusers are often protected. So what did they consider and what were the costs? Because there are almost always costs, but do they have regrets? Would they do it all over again? And how did it contribute to their growth or healing? And Emily, these stories are so profound. Oh, I'm getting choked up just thinking about it. Because, of course, not one person has said they regret it. And every single person has just had so much wisdom to share in terms of encouraging other people to speak up or in how people can cope with the consequences of speaking up when those costs occur.
I have been privileged to have sneak peeks into a couple of these episodes. So I can attest to how incredibly moving the conversations are, inspiring the people are. And I think, this conversation was really helpful to give us context around what's happening in the legal system, what's happening at social, cultural levels, but to have this really human level of this experience and wisdom that comes through in your episodes just adds a whole new layer that is incredibly important to be part of the conversation.
Thank you. I hope so. And, I'm doing this all on my own. It's incredibly time consuming, but I feel so passionate about it. And my hope is that if I can get enough people to listen and download, that I can ultimately get a production company to pick up and help me so that I'm not doing it on my own. So if anyone's listening who has any connections, send them my way.
Please send them Jill's way. In this world of podcasting these days, it's actually really important, this level of resources. So I really admire your ambition, your passion, and your grit to make this happen, Jill.
Well, and as I talked about in the episode, if I had known forensic psychology was a thing, I would have gone in that direction. And as you know, I am a true crime junkie. I am a law and order junkie. And so, this sort of feels like I'm also fulfilling a little bit of that forensic psychology dream.
While helping people.
While hopefully helping.
Yeah.
So on that note, we hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and I hope that you will follow me over to We the Sunlight this fall. Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.